Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Echo podcast, the subject of which this afternoon is the psychology of ESG. Are we losing the argument in the boardroom? Now, we couldn't have a better guest to talk about this. Susan Hooper is described as a serial board director. She's worked for an amazing array of organizations during her career, including Wrangler Jeans. Anyone remember them from way back when? Saatchi and Saatchi, McKinsey, currently a non-exec at Uber. She's worked at the Rank Group, Saga. But for the purpose of our discussion this afternoon, Susan, I think the most interesting thing about you is on your LinkedIn, you describe yourself as a stubbornly optimistic environmentalist. And so I suppose my first question really in the light of this discussion about the backlash against ESG is, why do you feel you have to be stubborn at the moment to make the point of optimism? Because it strikes me that a lot of people who have been enthusiastic about the movement over recent years are maybe a bit disheartened at the moment, but I get the sense that you're not.
Well, that's a loaded question, and actually you've lumped in there my adherence to ESG, which I'm actually not very pro ESG. So let me pick those pieces out. But I think the very pithy answer to your point is things are pretty serious at the moment with regards to sustainability, our ability to adapt our current systems of business to achieve targets which were all agreed to in Paris many, many decades ago. And therefore, I think you need to be stubbornly optimistic, because it's hard sometimes to be optimistic, especially if you're at the, and I'd love someone to come up with a better metaphor than this one, but at the coalface, we've got to come up with a more sustainable comparison there. But when you're at the coalface of sustainability in business, it's taking time, and it's sometimes very hard to remain optimistic. So you have to work at that as well. But just to bring up a point, which I think probably could be the core of our discussion today anyway, is ESG. Am I sad to see it under fire? And actually, rather oddly, I'm not. And I'm not because I actually think the lumping of those three really important topics together has diluted our ability to focus on sustainability, or the E, because it's actually, relatively speaking, easy or standard to do well on the S and the G. And I know people will think, oh, I'm minimizing them. I'm not minimizing them. But, E is a time-boxed issue where if we get S and G right, it's not going to wait for us to catch up and try and get it right. So for me, separating the three is fundamental to getting a quicker pace on action in it. And if that means that I then agree with the right-wing extremists, so be it. I'm actually happy to give on that one, because I think it's the right thing to do, perhaps for different reasons, but nonetheless, the outcome is the same. We split them. I'd be happy with that.
It's a subtle point, that, isn't it? Because the S and the G were there within the world of the Victorian philanthropist business person, weren't they? I mean, yes. They knew the value of creating port sunlight and treating their workforces well. And they knew, particularly in the light of the scandals of the 19th century to do with governments and fraud and things, that G was important. But they weren't really very mindful of the planet, were they, 150 odd years ago? And that's something that's come into our worlds really relatively recently. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, when you sort of first became aware of the fragility of the Earth, I mean, can you remember which decade you started to take an interest in it? I mean, I can remember Friends of the Earth back from when I was at university in the early 1980s, but it was a bit of a fringe interest then. But when did it really strike home with you?
Yeah, well, I think it's, first of all, it has been around for a long time, actually. The understanding that, emitting carbon dioxide is hurting our natural resources, and that actually there's a value to fresh air, there's a value to fresh water and all of that. I hate to say it, but I haven't really been on that bandwagon except for the past 5-6 years. And I do really take my hat off to those who've been around working on this for a lot longer. And there are hundreds of people like that. And it wasn't easy for exactly the same point you make, that you're sort of a fringe at that point, or even labeled as an activist. But I stumbled upon this by chance. I was sitting at the time, this was about 6 years ago. I was sitting on about 6 boards, one of which was an airline, and I was invited to a dinner at Cambridge Hughes Hall that spearheads a lot of work on climate change, wanting to discuss the topic, why is it that boards don't have climate change on their agenda? And guess what? Of the 6 boards, including an airline, none of them had it on the agenda. This is just 6 years ago. And, you know, we were spoken to by very eloquent climate scientists, very passionate, who insist as well, they may be really good at this topic, but they aren't good at making stuff happen within business. It's up to the business people to make it. They also highlighted how it has really got worse over the past 30, 40 years, which, by the way, happens to coincide with the best times of my life, where I happily enjoyed things which I realize now I should have been more knowing about and doing. So I got to the end of the dinner thinking, excuse my French, but holy shit, I'm part of the problem, and it's a big problem and it needs to be solved. I have 2 boys that I adore as my children, and they are going to have to live in the world that I've lived in. I've helped create at any rate. And thirdly, and most importantly, I'm sitting in probably the most influential positions one could with regards to business. And I have 40 years of experience, which gives me a certain clout and credibility, and I need to do something about it. And it was really that trigger. And I was there with a number of other non-execs, and on the train back home to London, we agreed to pull together to work on something we now call Chapter Zero, which is an organization that helps non-exec boards and chairs get up to steam on the topic of sustainability. And really, I've just sort of shifted my focus to say, what time remains in my career time, I'd like to dedicate on using the influence that I've got and the understanding and capabilities that I'm gaining to try and impact and accelerate action on this topic.
Now, I got a tricky one for you here. Have you got more confidence in the powers of the business community or the political community actually to do something positive over the next few years? Because it seems to me that we hear an awful lot from our politicians, not just in this country, but in many others. And when things become a bit too tricky and it costs money and all the rest of it, suddenly they're backpedaling on everything. And certainly something I felt over recent years is that there's a more earnest desire to get something done among the business community than there is among the political community, who just seem to sort of think about the next 5 years and whether they're going to get re-elected or not.
Well, I think you've just answered the question. The reality is politics and politicians and policy could make this problem change within hours of implementation. And I have a few examples, albeit small, I suppose, in the big picture of things where that has happened. But the reality is that the politicians are not doing that. And possibly for understandable reasons of re-election, and if you're not in power, you're not going to be able to implement. But there's also very, very little leadership of people who'll stick their neck out and say, this is the right thing to do. We have to hunker down and we have to do it. And by the way, business is only ever going to gain momentum if we have a level playing field across all companies and industries. That's just not happening. And I think it was back in Glasgow, in the COP that was held in Glasgow, that I realized that actually we were shifting away from looking for government to do something to getting behind the businesses that already have traction, and many already had traction at that point. So I think the reality is there are more businesses than governments. This is a very personal issue. You either believe the scientists or you don't. You may choose one or the other. And there are more people running companies than there are running governments who feel that they have to do something. So for now, our momentum is greater within business, and it could be even greater with policy, and it could be even greater with leaders who buy into the science and the need for individuals, companies, and organizations to do something.
We know very well, because the research shows it, that it's a very powerful factor if you put your hand above the parapet and say you want to do something about ESG. I remember reading something that said that Unilever was the most sought after company on the graduate milk round. They were getting the highest quality of graduates in because of the trailblazing approach that they took. But then the noises that seemed to have been coming from there over, the last year or so was that they were maybe having second thoughts about it. The share price wasn't quite where it was and all the rest of it. It's quite difficult in the world of business to see it through, isn't it? Because it's so bumpy, and you're going to get resistance all the way down the line, aren't you, from the Terry Smiths of this world who say, what's the purpose of Hellman's mayonnaise? This is a load of nonsense and the rest of it. There's a consistent pressure from the antis, isn't there, to buckle, to give way?
No question. No question. However, if you hear Alan Jope talk from Unilever, they will say they do not do sustainable products and adaptations for the good of mankind. They do it because they make more money out of them. And I'm sort of sat on the fence on that one, because I think there may be some investment needed to be made in order to go to the right direction. But ultimately, capitalism is based on doing the right things for a community of people and making money and then reinvesting that in all of the above. And so I think it's important. Most companies that are doing well are making money somehow, in some way. And should be no embarrassment to that. I think what you're seeing the backtracking on, though, is more about ESG. It's the use of the three words, and that you're getting pressures primarily in the States. And I think it's important to remember that the backlash, it may come over here, but it's not over here like it is in the States. And everything in the States is getting polarized and politicized. And luckily here, not yet. Again, we sometimes follow. I hope we don't. But nonetheless, if you're really serious about any one of those three, there's no issue in splitting them up and facing them head on independently. And each company has a different set of issues. So for Unilever, I think their biggest challenge is the E, given their footprint in terms of product development and geopolitical impact elsewhere. So I think it's right that they focus on making money, but they do have to bow to all of the investors who also put pressure on them as well.
It's always seemed to me that Unilever are in an absolutely impossible position. I remember Stuart Rose years and years ago when I was talking to him at Marks and Spencer's about Plan A, when they decided they were going to, put their heads above the parapet and do something. And I remember him saying that they were immediately descended upon by dozens, if not hundreds, of pressure groups, each with their individual argument about what M&S had to be doing. And he said it was sort of bewildering knowing how to sort of work your way through that and to find where the true path to virtue was. It's not easy, is it? Working out how to do the right thing.
I do think that everything you're talking about comes down to making sure you have the right leaders of your organization. Honestly speaking, if you're not ahead on this topic, you will be constantly behind and either fall foul of the investors, the activist groups, the politicians, whomever. But to be ahead of it, you have to really believe in it, that it's something that matters, that it's something that you can do something about, and that's something that you need to re-hone your skills, because none of us know what to do. No one knows what the full answer is. And you're going to be going into areas of risk that we've never seen before, and need to manage not just the investors, but the employees as well. But if you are a leader who thinks, well, I'll put that off until the cost of living crisis is over, you're not committed to it, and you will fall behind others, and then you will be dictated to by those others.
I remember reading a fascinating paper from Exeter University, the headline for which was "Why ESG Investing Generates Value by Lower Returns," which was clearly a wonderfully provocative thing to sort of. But their research seemed to show, and it rang true to me, that firms with high ESG scores had lower risk profiles compared to firms with lower scores. And furthermore, they weren't as affected by the business cycle as well. Because if you do at the moment, if you plow, because your ESG portfolio is maybe not doing so well and you plow into oil and gas and tobacco and arms and all the rest of it, surely what they're hinting at, particularly with climate stuff, is years down the line, we're going to be seeing massive litigation against those companies, aren't we, who've put all the carbon into the atmosphere? So it is a huge risk doing that, isn't it, both financially and ethically?
Yes, I think it is. I'm not quite sure of the connection between the Exeter paper and that statement, but the litigiousness of multiple areas within society now. So the youth, industries, communities, against both business and government, is ramping up significantly. I don't know if you saw, I think it was last year, Client Earth, which is a pro bono organization that focuses exactly using the law to affect and accelerate change, took Shell to court, and they didn't win, but boy, did it strike the fear of God into every single boardroom, about exactly what could happen if they don't make the right decisions. And I think, all power to them, because they're not recreating the law, they're using the law to make sure that the right decisions are being made. And I do think that is yet another weapon in the arsenal of trying to accelerate action towards climate change.
Now, you mentioned the States, and we can't avoid talking about the States, although you've said it's not your area of expertise. And it does seem to me that it's got into an almost Alice in Wonderland type world there now, where BlackRock they consciously won't use the phrase ESG investing, and they're talking about transition investing, because they know if they use that three-letter acronym, then pension funds in Texas will stop, putting money with them and things like that. I mean, how has this come about? I mean, you must try and unpick it in your mind, where we've got to this ridiculously polarized position of denial on one hand and belief on the other.
Well, I do actually have a significant vested interest in the US because I'm a US citizen. So I follow this very, very closely. And I think it is a totally unique situation of polarization and politicization, and such that any party will fall onto vernacular used by the other party to indicate reasons why not, or reasons to think Armageddon is around the corner. I've already said to you, though, I think putting ES and G together is the wrong thing to do to affect change within business. I think it was done along the same lines as a lot of greenwashing is often done, to make people feel good, to be able to track it and monitor it. But the reality is it affects everyone differently, and you get lumped in. It's a bit like you see the Republicans trying to lump in immigration issues in the States with, funding of Ukraine at the same time. They are two separate things. You need to solve them separately. And I just think decoupling them has to add value for everyone. And if it's for my reasons are not the same as the far right wing, Republicans, but if we're both wanting to do the same thing, I'm happy to capitulate on that. And I think an awful lot of this has to be seen as the need to collaborate together and to work together, even if your rationale is different. So, there's so much being talked about transgender at the moment, which is 0.1% of the population. And, it's like, if that's something which is relevant to you or to the company you work for, focus on it. If it's anything less than the importance of timely change, adaptation of your business model and transition planning towards a net zero future, it's going to have to take second fiddle right now. So, and I think this kind of touches on the point you're making. I think everyone has their pet hobby at the moment, but what we're missing is, when I say pet hobby is the wrong thing, but pet subject matter that is very personal to them. But what we need right now are leaders, both in business and politics, who understand the bigger picture of what life will look like, whether you solve this problem first, this problem first, or this problem first, and not worry about re-election, not worry about their bonus in that year, and just make the right decisions. And yeah, I feel like we're missing out on a number of them in many places.
Tell me about how your role works in a practical sense, because you must get hired by these organizations because this is a specific interest of yours. So when you appear on a board for the first time, what's your strategy for convincing the board of the importance of sustainability to its reputation, to its business strategy, and how to make it the norm rather than the exception? I mean, do you have a fixed way you go about that, or are you very flexible depending on the sort of, the mood and the characters of the board who are sitting around you in the organization?
It's an interesting question, because one of the things that's really important for everyone to know is I am not a climate scientist. I'm not a climate specialist, but I have started to go up the learning curve with respect to what boards can do. And the other thing is, as a board member, even as a chair, you don't actually do anything. You are responsible, however, and accountable for everything. If the last word is with the board. So actually, what you as a board member need to be doing is making sure that the leadership is right, that the strategy is right, that the succession coming through is right for the longer term strategy of the company, and that the right decisions on finances and profitability are being made. So I do hate to be on a board where I call it the tallest poppy. Tallest poppy tends to get chopped off quickest, but I do prefer working with boards who get they have an issue and they don't need to be converted about the issue. I'll save that for the younger people to do, but I see the end of the tunnel coming up soon on my career. I don't want to be converting people. I want to be working with boards that want to do that.
But have you come across examples during your career where you've gone in somewhere and you felt that you couldn't do what you wanted to do and you've given up and left?
Yes. I can't really talk about them though, because that would be
indiscreet.
Yes.
But how many times has that happened then? Give us a rough idea how often that's happened.
Twice. That's quite a big decision. But again, I talk a lot to future potential board members, and I think no one should go into a board role without having clear ideas of their own sets of values and beliefs, because that's why they are hired, is to bring that in and be ready if those values and beliefs are not being represented to step down. You don't have to create a big, explosion as a result of it, but ultimately it's your reputation on the line, and you will have to live with that reputation. Even you can even say, well, I disagreed with it. That doesn't matter. This is a position where you can determine the outcome of a company.
All right, then by contrast, give an example of an organization where you went in and you were flying from the word go and you really felt that you'd added enormous value and you went on a journey together that was a success.
Well, it's an interesting one. And I can talk about this one, even though there's a few slight negatives in there as well. And that would be on the Uber board in the UK. And sustainability was, honestly speaking, not on the agenda at the time when I first started on the board, which is now five and a half years ago. And during the time I was newly on the board, Sadiq Khan implemented, he didn't bring it in because that came in under the Conservatives, but he implemented the ultra-low emission zone in London. And just remembering that London is probably one of the most important cities for Uber worldwide. You can imagine the fear that was struck there is by 2025, unless they had a fleet of EVs, they were going to lose drivers because they couldn't afford to be in the center of London. So business would just go. So overnight, and this is the power of policy, even if it's just a small policy as it was at the time, even though it's now contested, overnight, Uber changed its global strategy by focusing on London and saying by 2025, we have to have 100% EVs for our drivers. Now, remember, at the time, the drivers were not employees. So there's a massive challenge of how to do that. And I've talked with Dara, the CEO, latterly after this. And I did sort of poke him and said, we would not be as sustainable as we now are had Sadiq Khan not brought in that ultra-low emission zone. And he laughs and says, yes, it's absolutely true. But we are where we are now. And now Uber is forging ahead globally, not just in London, although London is the lead city for that. using data that is collected on customers and how they travel to offer more carbon efficient routes that they could take, or even different options of vehicles or types of public service. So it's radically changed Uber in the course of about 3 or 4 years.
I met him a couple of weeks ago, Sadiq Khan, and went up to him and shook his hand, actually, because I live not only in one of the first low traffic neighborhoods in London, but also within the ULEZ. And my youngest child, my 14-year-old daughter, was asthmatic, and which was unquestionably linked to the fact that she lived in the centre of London. And since those two things came in, her asthma is far better.
It is the power of policy. I also, I think he's my favorite politician, because it has not been easy for him to stick with that. And I just respect people. He's got a lot of enemies for sticking with that, both politicians and citizens. And but it's the right thing to do. It's what needs to happen.
But there is, I mean, this brings us back to the power of the backlash thing. He travels around now with bodyguards in a Range Rover, doesn't he? I mean,
but he's not the only MP.
No, I know, but
he's not the only.
But
elected.
I mean, that's a very sort of, you don't expect that sort of thing in our country, do you? Still, but you say it's not there to the extent it is there in the States. But there are a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, are still sort of violently angry with him for stuff like that, aren't they?
Yeah, and the reality is, with tough decisions like that, there will be people who don't fare well.
Yep.
But to be perfectly honest, the number of people who won't fare well unless we start to change
Yep.
is significantly higher, is significantly more expensive to the taxpayer as well. And that's really easy to say if it's not me who's suffering. I recognize that, and it's a dilemma we have to work out how to deal with.
In a practical sense, then, so what role do stricter regulation and closer, proper auditing protocols have in delivering that sort of lasting change? Because we've seen so many examples of systems being gamed, haven't we? But do you feel that there is kind of progress on that front now? And we are, because it's a very, very immature, youthful industry, isn't it? We've only been thinking about this for a relatively short space of time, and inevitably there are going to be mistakes along the way. But do you think we're on the right path when it comes to regulation and audit now?
Okay, again, a lot in that. I think regulation is absolutely essential in markets where traction is not being achieved. And regulation 10 years ago would have made an awful lot of sense. Regulation now is less relevant, although still would be manna from heaven in many respects, because businesses are catching up. But businesses as a whole, corporate UK, corporate America, is filled with different personalities, and the leaders necessary to lead us out of this mess into the next, deconstruct what they've got and reconstruct it, leaving out carbon and methane and all this kind of stuff, are few and far between. So there is, I would love more regulation. And I can't believe I'm saying that, because I think one of the worst things about board jobs are having to deal with regulators. And mostly regulators have come in where a market is not working efficiently, but they aren't as well informed as the market. So they bring in regulation, which is only, onerous and creates admin and work, which distracts you from the core of what you're trying to do. So regulation per se is a horrible thing to have to live with within, the corporate UK. But we need it now. And we need it for a number of reasons. One, we don't have enough leaders. We also don't have enough ability for companies to understand what the level playing field looks like. And without a level playing field, you leave it up to the good guys, so to speak, to do what they want, while the others still go ahead and try and make as much money as they can, get their bonuses, and leave without having solved the fundamental problem.
Inevitably, as we're going to come towards the end of this conversation now, we have to talk about the reputational impact of these things, because that's after all what Echo does. They measure that very critical thing these days, that what people think of you as an organization. Now, do you think that is maturing now, that it's actually much subtler and more real than people have thought it is up until now?
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. And I think it manifests itself most clearly in ability to attract employees to a company. That's a real issue now for many companies, in that mostly the younger generation, but not all, and I count myself not in the younger generation anymore, there are people who won't go, who look to see what the track record on ethics and environment are within companies, and that never happened before. And that, I do believe, given where we're headed with regards to issues in the environment, will only get bigger, not smaller. And there's initiatives popping up all over the place to enhance people's individual actions on all fronts, including choice of employer, choice of pension, choice of brands and food, that will impact deeply. So yes, it's changing. And I think, again, it comes back. I know I'm beating this dead horse, but the leadership is fundamental, and really leading through uncertainty, but with clarity of purpose, not saying we've achieved it, because no one's achieved net zero yet. And, to come out with the meaningful statements that include and incorporate employee sentiment and actions is what my mind will be leading to a stronger reputation going forward.
All right. Now, look, my final question is, if you were a combination of a leader of a very powerful business and a politician, and you could wave your magic wand and make 2 or 3 things happen tomorrow, both on a kind of micro and a macro sense, or maybe even on a sort of, mind-changing sense, what would those things be for you, if you could sort of say, well, let it be thus, and it would happen?
Well, I think it's you asked me, you started asking me, what do you mean by stubbornly optimistic? It was like, I have to be stubborn about focusing on where I can make a difference. I have understanding of politicians, but I can't impact the government in the UK, the US, or China. I can't do that. I can impact business. So I have to focus my mind on where I can have impact. I would love it if the politicians would get their act together, if we'd have some real leaders who lead based on, realities as opposed to re-elective points. But I'm not in a position to be able to impact that other than with my single vote. And therefore, I think it's about businesses ensuring that they have transition plans embedded in their own corporate strategies that see by 2030 that they are 50% of the way, which, by the way, is an incredibly steep mountain. And every year we seem not to have made any progress. So the mountain gets steeper and steeper until we're almost at a vertical takeoff. But it is the only way I can see that happening if policymakers don't start to take the lead.
So you do retain that optimism despite, are you less optimistic than you were a couple of years ago?
No, if anything, I'd say I'm more optimistic. I have seen significant changes. I have seen the understanding that businesses need to rally around sorting this out themselves and not wait for regulators to come in. The use of coal has significantly reduced, which is the single biggest issue that we've got globally. The trouble is, at the same time, energy usage has gone up at a similar place. So net, it looks like, it's the same. But there will be some tipping points, and hopefully positive ones, coming within the next 5 years. There has been a lot of action. It's just not concerted enough, and we lose time debating which is the right method and who's responsible and all this, as opposed to just getting on and doing it, which is where I again come back and say, I'm just going to focus on where I can make a difference. And that little difference, if everyone else is making it too, will add up.
Well, look, Susan, thank you so much for that. I mean, you have to be right about that, don't you? Because the alternative to optimism is pessimism. And ultimately, that is a selfish option, isn't it? Because it sort of assumes that you can say, you sit there and think, well, there's nothing we can do anyway, and I'll be dead within a few years. And then we've let down the generations to come, haven't we? So there's no excuse but not to be optimistic and try and do something.
Just last one word, because optimism can be perceived as being naivety. But if you say optimism as I can do something and I can't not do it because it's on my watch, that to me is what I mean by optimism. It's like I can't ignore the fact that I'm in a position of influence. I have a sphere of influence. I have a pond I have, control over, so to speak. And I need to work on that. I can't remind myself that my pond pales in comparison to the size of China and the US, but it's a pond. And I'm going to try and impact.
It's little steps in the pond, isn't it? It's steps that you can do. But anyway, look, Susan, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll be back with the next episode of the Echo podcast very soon. So finally, thank you, Susan, so much. That was terrific.
Lovely to speak with you again, Matthew.